So then, new year, new camshaft.
Yeah, totally new program to try. So we had a lot of fun last year. And I feel like we've made a bunch of improvements this year.
We've continued to learn. Every time we do this, we learn a little bit more. So if you don't know, we'll give you kind of the backstory. This is the original Engine Performance Expo LS.
Yep.
It started off as a bunch of the parts contributed to do the machining and all the different demonstrations in the very first Engine Performance Expo. Then we got this crazy idea of, hey, why don't we put all those parts together?
Build an actual engine.
Right.
Yep.
We did that. And what will normally happen when you have an engine built from a various sundry of parts, we faced a few challenges.
Yeah, honestly, it wasn't that impressive. We thought it was, it was good, just wasn't great. But that's because the engine really is a system, and you need all of the parts in the system to be pulling the same direction. And while that first iteration of the engine was good, the reason it wasn't great is because we had a bunch of help from a lot of different people. And so we had all these different chefs, and nobody was really in charge of making the soup. So what we ended up with is a bunch of really good parts, none of which truly matched everything else. And so we kind of had to take a step back that next year and go, okay, how do we work on this and tune and refine the package?
Right. I mean, we were able to meet the goal. So the first year goal was make 1,000 horsepower on boost.
That's right.
With an engine less than 400 cubic inches, and we were able to do that really pretty
easily. Now, we did get limited back then because we had some fuel pump issues.
Right.
So we kind of went back and we added a second fuel pump and another regulator. We went through a bunch of iterations there, but we got to where it was pretty reliable, right?
Oh, yeah. It could easily run and do that. But the neat part is you got into doing combustion analysis, and that's really was a game changer.
It was, because the first thing that we did before we got to the combustion analysis is we went to the spintron. So we took that engine, the first kind of the machine parts, then we had a real engine, then it was like, all right, how do we make it better? And of course, us, we always want to turn more RPM. So we went to the spintron, made lots of changes there, and that's what kind of got us up there to be able to run the higher RPM and get more power. So when we started playing around with the boost, that we learned right away with that ProCharger supercharger, right? The higher we turn it, the more boost it would make. And so the thing just kept going up and up and up. So it was interesting because the original kind of camshaft that we had, it wasn't like the best fit naturally aspirated. Remember, we changed headers and all kinds of stuff, and there wasn't really anything we could do to fix it. But like magic, we put the ProCharger on there and suddenly, man, it was like, this is awesome. This thing's
boost
great.
fixes everything.
I kind of learned that through the iterations. But then what happened is we got into like, okay, we got a lot of the low-hanging fruit, and now what we want to do is really try to push the next level. So we went through the process of drilling all the cylinder heads and machining them to accept the Kistler combustion sensors. And last year we ended up running the thing and collecting a bunch of data on the engine, and that really helped us with our tune-up. So we learned a bunch of things last year about what we thought the engine wanted versus what it really wanted, and we ended up picking up a bunch more power that way.
In the end, the first year we were making a little over 1,000 horsepower.
Yeah, about 1,040, I think, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Last year we're making
1280.
Yeah, 1280 pretty easy. It's like consistently 1280, 1290 all the time.
I think maybe we cracked 1300 just a little bit. And that, again, that was great. But we could see the camshaft events, the four, intake opening, intake closing, exhaust opening, exhaust valve closing. We could see from the combustion data that they weren't ideal. Now, the reason you could see that is because you could actually overlay your cam events into the cylinder pressure data, and you could say, well, look what the cylinder pressure is doing, for example, when I'm closing my intake valve. And one of the things that we saw was the piston would get to bottom dead center, and it would start going up, and our cylinder pressure would start to rise, and then it would start to fall before we got to the intake valve closing. What that told us is, well, we were holding the valve open so long that it was shoving air back out the hole, the intake valve. What we did is we went back and we called up our buddy Chris Straub and said, hey, we got an idea. Could you grind these few other camshafts? And we came up with some numbers that was not based on my idea or my emotions or my thoughts. It was data driven. So it was like, here's the problem we have. Overall, power level it's making, not too bad. Now I'm talking specifically about the naturally aspirated, but there's this big hole in the torque curve that we just couldn't fix. We advanced, we retarded, we tried different header
links, everything. With the NA, that hole, and it's a giant gaping hole in the torque curve, is just ugly. It's like, if you had to run this engine NA, you would not run it this way.
It just wasn't great.
You would change something.
So we decided to change the camshaft.
Right.
And lo and behold, using that data-driven approach from the combustion sensors. I could actually put it up here. I don't know if you guys will be able to see it, but I'm going to put it up here just for reference. If I come down here and I look, we went from 466 foot-pounds of torque. Now I'm talking about, let's see here.
The original cam.
We were at about 4,800 RPM or in there. We were 466 foot-pounds of torque before. Put the new cam in. Really, I didn't even touch the tune-up. I just wanted to see what it would do. The thing picked up almost 50 foot-pounds of torque. It's way over 500. I think at that specific spot there, 510, but real close to 50 foot-pounds of torque, and that was awesome. Like, it literally felt like such a, high five, we did it, we accomplished our goals. But with so many things in life, there's no free lunch.
Nope, there's not.
We'll go to the chalkboard here in a little bit, and I'll show you the specific changes we made, but by moving that camshaft and changing that event, we got exactly what we wanted to fill in that big hole in the torque curve. But one of the nice things that we had before that we were enjoying was it just kind of kept sailing up top no matter how high we went. I mean, it didn't peak till, I don't know, 7,800 or 8,000 or something, and it was cool. The problem is the average guy's not going to drive his car there. You're going to spend a lot more time between 4,000 and, say, 6,800 than you ever will between, say, 7,000 and 8,000.
Well, a perfect example, the original cam, if you had a car that had a torque converter on it, you would not be very happy with your engine.
Yeah.
It made a big number at the top, but you would not be quick down the racetrack because it was giving up so much bottom end torque to be able to move the car. Now,
that's right.
Again, you had a stick car and you could run up there very high RPM.
Ratios,
you could do it. All right, you can make that work for you. But most people have
given a typical application, you would not want a torque curve that looked that way with this big hole that makes a giant peak number. But honestly, that's the mistake that a lot of younger sort of neophyte engine builders make, is I just care about that big number, that peak number on the dyno.
It's hard to be, I mean, it makes you feel good to see the big number.
It does. It just doesn't move your car.
Right.
So with everything there comes a price. To get that 50 foot-pounds of torque, we had to give something away, which means the power above about, let's say, 6,800 or 7,000, it kind of falls off.
Well, right around 7,000. If you roll this thing over here to, say, right at 7,400, well, it's 20. It's down 20.
20 foot-pounds, which equates to about 30 horsepower.
Right, yeah.
So a lot of people look at that and go, oh, man, that cam lost 30 horsepower. I'm like, no. It gained 50 foot-pounds. And so what we need to do is look at the average across the run.
That's right, yeah.
And so when we do that, even if you go to 7,500 and you can see that the peak power number is down at 7,500, really anything about 6,800 and below, it's better everywhere, and it's so much better that the total average, even if you were to go all the way to 7,500, is still a net gain.
I think it was around, from like 4,500 to 7,000, the average gain was like 15 foot-pounds.
Right. You would never want to give that away.
No, I'll take that every day.
So many times we have to deal with the emotions of being a dyno operator, engine builder, tuner, or whatever, and when you pull that handle and the thing goes up and you see the number pop up on the screen and your peak number is way down, you go, man, I feel like I missed it, right?
That's why it's important to sit behind your own engine every once in a while.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's the thing. Like me and Dad, with our two-stroke stuff, same thing. We've been on the dyno, and you can see this pipe will make this number.
Yep.
But you look at the torque curve, and you're like, man, it only makes it for a really short range.
That's right.
I can go put that pipe on the car, go to the racetrack, and feel it accelerate.
That's right.
I can put on this other one that doesn't have that big number, but has a broader torque curve, and it feels like you have nitrous.
Yeah. I mean, unless you have a car that has the ability to sit right at that, in this case, let's say 7,500 RPM and stay there, you're not going to recognize any benefit, right? So everywhere else other than that camshaft was down from what we have now. When we saw that, we were like, man, what we had last year was when we changed from the naturally aspirated engine and put the boost on, the boost fixed it, right? Yep. Like, sweet, it went way up top and it carried super high, and it was like, we might have hurt ourselves there.
When we did the cam change yesterday, I thought for certain
we were in trouble.
Yeah. It's like, okay, it's going to make more torque, but we're not going to make more power.
Yep.
And the damn thing surprised us.
A funny thing happened on the way to the dyno. Every time we do this, I feel like we learn something new. In this case, when the engine was naturally aspirated, because we had made the cam timing a lot shorter, at really high RPM, it hurt the volumetric efficiency.
Yes.
And so then, obviously, I was pretty sure it was going to hurt the volumetric efficiency with high RPM, and even higher RPM with boost. And you know what? It did.
Yes, it did.
But the funny thing about that is when we talk about boost, we should probably define what we mean. Boost is when we measure the pressure in the intake manifold.
Right.
So I have to ask myself, well, how did it get there? Well, it got there because our supercharger's gear-driven, or in this case, belt-driven.
Yep.
So for any given engine speed, the supercharger's turning the same speed.
Positive displacement. Yep.
Yeah, it was putting out the same amount of airflow. So that means if our engine's volumetric efficiency actually went down,
right,
and the supercharger's still putting the same amount of air out, it had to go somewhere. So what happened is it stacked up in the inlet manifold. So really, anytime the intake manifold pressure is higher than the pressure outside, we call that boost. If the pressure in the intake manifold is lower than the pressure outside, we call that vacuum, right? So whether or not we get boost or vacuum is a function of how fast the engine's taking in and processing the air versus how fast the air is coming out of our supercharger. So what happened was when we made the first run, it was like, oh, something went wrong. This thing actually made more boost than it was supposed to. And then we'd had to think about it for it's like, no, that's exactly what should have happened. If the volumetric efficiency of the engine went down, but the supercharger's putting out the same amount of air, well, then the boost went up. And so what's interesting is that when it all worked out, we actually ended up not losing any torque at the bottom of the supercharged run.
None.
But we gained a significant amount of power up top.
It did.
Now, how is that possible? How do you lose volumetric efficiency and gain power?
Well, I think it's important here to note that because we have the combustion analysis, it will actually show you the volumetric efficiency in each cylinder. So it's easy to take all 8 cylinders, put it together, and know exactly what the VE of the engine is.
That's right.
At any given engine speed.
Yep.
So it became pretty simple math to start working out and say, okay, wait, our boost did this, our VE did that, and yeah, I'll let him do all the math. But it was amazing.
Yeah, it was cool. I mean, I think what we saw just in rough numbers, we saw about a 6% reduction in volumetric efficiency. And it's like, kind of saw that coming.
Yeah.
However, what we saw was somewhere in the neighborhood of about a 9 to 9.5% increase in the boost because of it. So really, the net change, 9.5% minus 6%, was around a 3 to 3.5% change positive in total density. So funny enough, if you take that and multiply it by our old power number, we were within 3 horsepower of what it should have made if you had a 3 or 3.5% change in net density. So it doesn't always work out that way, but in this case, having the volumetric efficiency of the engine go down caused the boost to go up. And when the boost went up, it increased the density of the air. So it turns out in this case that what we gained in density was more than we lost in volume, and mass airflow was the winner because the definition of mass airflow is volume in CFM times the density of air in pounds per cubic foot. So the engine doesn't care how we got more air mass as long as we got it. Whether you get that from greater VE and the same boost, way greater VE and a little less boost, or way less VE and more boost, the net change was more mass airflow, more fuel consumption, therefore more power. This literally was just dumb luck. You can see that coming when the camshaft helped the bottom end and hurt the top end. I thought for sure it was going to hurt us at higher RPM with the boost, but we dodged a bullet this time and got away with it. Now, as we keep going up in RPM, that's probably going to change in a hurry because the efficiency is going away on us. We can clearly see that. So when my 6% reduction in VE and my 9% increase in boost, when those two start to trade places, when my VE's falling off faster than I can recoup it with boost, that's when you're going to start running out of power. And you see this all the time in boosted applications, superchargers, turbos, where you go, man, I turned up the boost, but it didn't make any more power. Well, that's because the boost wasn't free, and so you had to do something to get it. So as long as your net change means more mass of air, you're going to expect more power.
And just turning more RPM isn't going to fix it either, because we know that there's a frictional increase as we increase RPM. So
no free lunch.
We hated it. We hated it.
But in the end, we made more power. So
we
it's
did.
sort of like it would be easy to high-five yourself and go, I'm so great. I'm such a smart engine builder. But the reality is we just fell into that by dumb luck. The reality is we set out to fix the hole in the torque curve, and we did exactly that. The payment for that for the naturally aspirated engine was less VE at high RPM. I'll still take that trade any day of the week. This particular application actually worked out in our favor because it gave us enough extra boost to make up for the loss in VE. You know what? I'll take it.
Over a 3-year period, it's not too bad to go from 1,000 horsepower to 2,500. 1,300.
1,280. 1,000 to 1,280.
Yeah, 1,000.
2,500 would be
1,000
great.
horsepower to 1,280. Yeah, been nice. Not fuel thing, but
And then from 1,280 to make it all the way to 1,330, 35 or 32. Man, I'm not disappointed at all. This has been a great adventure. Can't wait to see what comes next because we're nowhere near done with this engine.
Oh, just getting started. It still has a wet sump on it.
Yep. So we can still play with more camshaft stuff. We can play with our efficiency of the supercharger. We've got wet sumps versus dry sumps. We've got different oils. There is nowhere near a stopping point for us in terms of what we're going to learn.
Well, you just mentioned something about the different camshafts. So I think now would be a great time to head over to the whiteboard and show how we change those valve events, right? We've been talking about how changing those valve events is what actually changed the VE, what made the gain.
Sure.
So let's actually show you how to look at it and understand what changes we made and how they end up making more boost.
All right, I'll see you over there. All right, guys, so the first thing I want to do is I want to talk about what we actually saw in that. We keep talking about this combustion data. So what does that mean? How did we look at it and what did we actually see? So I'm going to draw a little graph for you here real quick that should kind of represent what the four-stroke cycle actually looks like if we're talking about combustion data, right? So I'm gonna come up here and I'm gonna make a little kind of like a plot. And so we're gonna call this side top dead center, and we're gonna call this side bottom dead center, all right? So what you're typically gonna see throughout the pistons travel from TDC to BDC is it's changing volume and it's changing pressure up here. So we're gonna call this a PV chart, pressure and volume. So this is volume, there's our pressure. So think about what you would normally expect as the piston moves from top dead center towards bottom dead center on your intake stroke, right? So I'd start over here near TDC, and my line's gonna kind of go down like this, somewhere around bottom dead center. Now at that point, the piston's gonna reverse, so my pressure's gonna start coming back up, and now I'm going to be on my compression stroke. So depending on how high or low your compression ratio is, will determine how steep this slope is going to be. So we're going to go ahead and go up and we're going to compress. And when we get to the top here, we're going to have our combustion where we have the ignition vent and now our pressures and temperatures are expanding. Now, of course, the piston begins to go back down. And so we get the expansion stroke here, back to bottom dead center. And then we have the exhaust where we're pumping it back out. And so what we get is a couple of what we call pressure loops. Up here we would call this one the work loop, and down here we would call this our pumping loop that we work out things like mean effective pressure. This one is like if we took all the average area in here, that's our mean effective pressure that's actually pushing down on the piston doing work. So we'll call this our work loop. And over here we have a loss as the piston's coming up, pumping all that dirty old exhaust out of the engine, and then pumping clean air back into the engine. So we'll call this our pump loop, right? So realistically, this one's taking away and this one's giving to me. So the net mean effective pressure is the difference between all this area and all this area. So in a perfect world, I want this one to be as big as possible and as high as possible in pressure. And I want this one to be as small as possible and as low as possible in pressure. So when we start looking at the data, what we like to do is we like to take a line and plot it in here, let's say, for example, on our chart, and we're going to call this intake valve closing, right? So what we look for is the theoretical slope that we should have along this line that's based on the laws of thermodynamics, and we look at the difference between that theoretical line and the line we actually got. So oftentimes what will happen is this pressure will start coming up and we are going to intersect the line that we made for when our intake valve closes. If this line was still going up, we might have closed the intake valve too early. If this line comes up and then starts going back down, that's because the piston is now pushing air back out that open intake valve, and so that means we closed the valve too late. So in this case, we were seeing a lot of that too late closing happening in the event. So we went to our cam card and we're like, let's see what we have here and let's make a change to it. So when I think about my cam card, a lot of people want to talk about lobe separation angles, intake center line, exhaust center line, and that's great, but the engine doesn't really respond to those things. Those things are really the consequence of what you choose for the 4 camshaft events. That would be intake valve opening, intake valve closing, exhaust valve opening, and exhaust valve closing. So looking at our chart, if this is intake valve closing, Then from there on, I do my compression, I have my ignition, I do my expansion. Somewhere over here, I would have exhaust valve opening. I'd come back and I would pump it out. Somewhere before top dead center, I'm going to have intake valve open. And then somewhere after top dead center, I'm going to have exhaust valve closing. And so we look at what the pressures are doing at each of these spots. Now, I like to plot out the piston's displacement, or where the piston is in the cycle, against my cam card events, because it helps me visualize it. Now, in fairness, the way that I'm going to plot this out here is a little different than a lot of the camshaft guys. Well, Billy Godbold, my buddy, he plots it 360 degrees off, so that you're going to see 0 on his plot would typically be where the overlap happens. On ours, the way that we've always been taught since 8th grade in auto shop is the 4 engine strokes are intake, compression, power, exhaust. So I like to start that way. Let me draw it up here, show you what I mean. So if I start over here, I'll call this 0. I'm going to draw a line that comes over here, and that's 720 degrees. So that's one complete engine cycle. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the piston's travel. So I'm going to go in the middle here. This would be 360 degrees, or what we'd say is TDC compression, right? So starting at 0, my piston travels down to the bottom on the intake stroke. So that would be 180 degrees. It then travels back up to the top here on the compression stroke. So now I'm at 360, okay? Piston goes back down to the bottom on the power stroke. So I'm at 540. And of course, then on the exhaust stroke, the piston travels back up to the top to get me to 720. Okay, so now when I look at the original camshaft that we had in the engine and I look at the events, what I had was, let's see here, I got some notes. So my intake valve opened 17 degrees before top dead center. So that means I'm going to be over here, IVO, 17 degrees before top dead center. All right, so that gets me on the exhaust stroke now. The exhaust valve is still open, but we'll get to that. So I'm going to go from there. I'm at top dead center. That starts my cycle over. The entire 180 degrees to bottom dead center. And then it closed at 61 degrees after bottom dead center. Okay, so when my piston went to bottom dead center and it started going back up, I waited 61 degrees, and we're talking about the at 50 numbers here, not the advertised numbers, but I waited 61 degrees after bottom dead center to close the valve. And we could see from the combustion data that that was considerably late relative to the pressures in the cylinder. What we wanted to do is we wanted to move our camshaft so that it would close that valve about 10 degrees earlier. So where does that need to be then? Well, if we were going to back that up, we would want to close the valve at 51 degrees after bottom dead center. Generally speaking, at lower engine speeds, the earlier you close that intake valve, the more trapping you're going to have of that mixture that came into the intake cycle. So that number primarily is what gave us that extra 50 foot-pounds that we found, the torque curve there. So I have 17 and 61 plus 180, right? So that ends up being 78 total degrees plus my 180, which gives me a camshaft duration of 258 degrees. I'll put it up here. We have 17 before plus 180 to get me to the bottom plus 61 degrees after bottom dead center. So 8, 14, 15, carry the 1, I get 258 degrees. We look at the exhaust side, we could do the same thing. So on the exhaust side, I was 67 and 23. So what that means is, on the exhaust side, I opened the exhaust valve 67 degrees before bottom dead center. Now that happens up here. I did compression, I got ignition, now I have my power stroke coming to bottom dead center. So 67 degrees before bottom dead center, 67 degrees before bottom dead center was when I opened my exhaust valve. Again, we're going to go from there to bottom dead center. Then we're going to go all the way back up to top dead center. And then 23 degrees after top dead center, A, T, D, C, is when we closed the exhaust valve. So our overlap period, when we talk about overlap, is my intake valve opened 17 degrees before I got to top dead center. My exhaust valve didn't close until 27 degrees after top dead center. So if you add those together, that would be 40 degrees of what we call overlap. on our second camshaft, we wanted to shorten that up too, because we could see our cylinder pressures here before and after top dead center were not ideal. They were too high when we were opening the intake valves. Because we were opening the intake valve here 17 degrees before top dead center, there was still considerable amount of exhaust pressure left in the cylinder. And what that's going to do is you start opening your intake valve, and guess what happens? It shoves it right back into the port. You get reversion that way. And so we wanted to go ahead and move that back up there and kind of save some of that time. We were at 9 degrees. We moved from 17 up to 9 degrees before top dead center. And then on the exhaust closing there, we moved that one also to 9 degrees after top dead center. You can see that what happened is we went from 40 degrees of overlap to only 18 degrees of overlap. That's a pretty significant change. And again, that worked really well for our lower RPM torque curve. But when the engine was naturally aspirated, it kind of cost us a little bit higher RPM. We really thought it was going to kill us when we did the supercharged edition of the engine. But in this case, it did in fact hurt the volumetric efficiency. But because we couldn't get that new boost to go in the engine, or however you want to look at it, it increased the density of the charge that was going into the cylinder, and our net change was actually better. So looking at our new camshaft, so our old one was 258 degrees on the intake, and then on the exhaust we had 67 before, plus 180, plus 23 after, right? So if I go 67 plus 180 plus 23, what you get is, let's see, that's 8, 10, and 7, carry the 1. There you go. 270 degrees and 258. So you can work out your centerline angles if you want on the old camshaft, but from memory, I think that one worked out to about a 112 LSA. And that means that halfway between my intake opening and my intake closing, I would reach max lift at about 112 degrees after top dead center. Halfway between my exhaust opening at 67 and my closing at 23, I would be about 112 degrees before top dead center. So you add those together, divide by 2, you get an LSA of 112. When we went to the new camshaft though, we moved our closing here 51 after bottom dead center. We closed that intake valve 10 degrees earlier, and we opened it 8 degrees later, so we waited longer before we opened it. So we ended up with a much shorter intake camshaft. On the second camshaft, we opened 9 degrees before, closed 51 after, 180 in the middle. So what you end up with is a 240 degree camshaft versus our 258, okay? Halfway between 9 and 51, we would have been an intake center line of about 111 degrees. Looking at our exhaust side, we went over here, and what we did is we kept the exhaust opening event exactly the same. We left it at 67, but on the new cam, instead of closing 23 degrees after, we closed at 9 degrees after. So then what we have is 67 plus 9 plus our 180, and we get, let's see, what is that? 9 and 7 is 16, I believe. 8 and 6 is 14, and 2 carry the 1, we get 256. Halfway between those would be roughly 119 degrees, 115 on our intake. Add those to, 111 on our intake. So you add those together, divide it by 2 to get the average. My LSA would have been 115 degrees. Okay, so a little lesson on plotting out your camshafts for you. Whether you do it my way or the other way where you move everything 360, you're still going to get the same numbers. I like to do it this way because in my brain it works well for piston travel, and then I can relate it to my PV chart. I hope that was helpful for you. I hope you can see how we took that data and determined what to do with the camshaft rather than go, I don't know, let's just try something different. This way produced results based on the data rather than the emotion. So take that for what you will, and we'll talk to you about it when we see you in person.
What a day, what a day, what a day. Yeah, my brain is swollen. I've learned so much today. They told us, don't start cars. We are not going to listen.